Hey, DawgNation, I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Probably a little depressing last night watching Alabama be as dominant as it was, winning the national championship. Certainly impressive to see, but also a reminder of just how high the bar is raised if you want to try to win a national championship in these modern times. We'll obviously talk about that on today's show, how it is that Georgia can get there, the people who already expect that Georgia might, take a step in that direction. Obviously, I'll have a lot to say on the Tyreek Stevenson situation. Admittedly, I'm not very happy about that. We'll put a bow on the end of the Justin Fields era in college football. Our buddy Connor Riley going to stop by and see us too. The opinions will be flying fast and furious, and almost certainly a good number of them will probably be wrong, but nonetheless, we're glad to have you with us. DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I hadn't even gone to bed yet, and typically I go to bed pretty early. Last night I stayed up until the end of the national championship game. I wasn't even on my pillow and with my eyes closed and asleep yet before the hype had already started for Georgia for the 2021 season. I'm not mocking it necessarily. I'm just kind of pointing out how quickly it came. Joel Klatt, the gadfly from Fox Sports, who's a little bit of a noted SEC hater, to be honest with you. He puts it out there, my preseason top whatever for next season, I got Georgia at number 1 and Alabama at number 2. Now, here's the thing I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to try to make this a theme for the offseason. This is my solemn vow to you, and I'm not being sarcastic here, I'm being serious. I am not going to participate at all this year in the off-season hype train. Now, when somebody else says something, I'll probably mention it on the show. But the one thing I'm going to try not to do is to, fan the flames of hysteria. Oh, Fox Sports analyst says Georgia preseason number 1. I'm just going to try not to do that. And it's not because I'm tired of being mocked by fan bases other than Georgia who, kind of have a good time with Georgia about that kind of stuff, for this time of year. It's got nothing to do with that. It's got to do, in my mind, with the respect that I think is due for just how hard of an accomplishment Alabama pulled off last night. Winning the national championship the way they did was such a flex. Such an impressive performance. The idea that some analyst with a few keystrokes on Twitter is going to say that Georgia is going to do that next season, boy, that's far easier said than done. And on this show, we are going to try our best to have respect for the process. Because think about this for a moment. If you take, Klatt seriously, he had preseason number 1 Georgia. He had Alabama preseason, number 2 for the 2021 season. Let me ask you this question. I mean this not rhetorically. I mean this literally. Would you feel comfortable rating Georgia ahead of Alabama in the preseason for next year? Would you really feel comfortable doing that? And you may say, oh, BA, they lose so much stuff. We thought they lost a bunch of stuff off last year's team. Let's be honest. The guy that just won the Heisman Trophy, Devontae Smith, last year was thought to be commonly no better than Alabama's 3rd best wide receiver. And even during this season, when Georgia played Alabama in October, I think there were plenty of people who thought Devontae Smith was no better than the 2nd best receiver on this team at a point this year. He would go on to win the Heisman Trophy. To be frank with you, I never thought Mac Jones would ever start a game for Alabama at quarterback, and yet he, statistically speaking, is probably the most dominant single-season quarterback the program's ever had. So what does Alabama have coming back for next year? I don't know. At least, broadly speaking, I don't know. But my guess is it's pretty good based on the way they reloaded this year. I'm not going to just vault Georgia ahead of Alabama for next season on the basis of words alone. Now I realize what some people come back and say in response to all of that. They'll say, well, BA, you don't realize Georgia's got JT Daniels. Daniels is 8-1 right now to win the Heisman Trophy for next season. Folks, do you realize that around this same time a year ago, Jamie Newman was 7-1 to win the Heisman Trophy? This is kind of the path that Georgia fans have kind of been down before. And please understand this. Don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that Georgia won't overtake Alabama and win next year's national championship. I'm not saying that it can't be done. I'm saying that when you watch the success that Alabama has enjoyed over the course of these years, I think you're reminded of just how difficult it truly is, just how significant the challenge is. It is not as easy as Alabama put on display last night. And in fact, I think I'll say it this way. Georgia is clearly in the short list of teams that can win a national championship. No one would deny that. Bud Elliott writes about this for 24/7 Sports and has written about that even prior to his time at 247 about, you got to recruit at a certain level to be in that championship picture. We kind of know who the championship teams are, at least the contenders. We kind of know who they're not. And frankly, I'm very thankful as a fan and as someone who does this for a living to be talking about a team who is at least in that conversation. It's really, really hard to even get in that discussion. So from that standpoint, the fact that Georgia is in the discussion of a team who might be able to do this next year, at least from that standpoint, that's pretty good. But it's all about those final key decisions, those final key moments that determine who's a contender and who actually reigns as the national champion. I think I'll say it this way. Think about Amazon.com for a moment. Now, listen, different people have different opinions about Jeff Bezos or Amazon or whatever else, but just think about the company for a moment. It's actually kind of amazing that it exists, right? This giant network of online orders and shipping and everything else. It's kind of an amazing apparatus when you really consider it all. Yet, at the very end, if the package that you order arrives a day later than you think it's supposed to, you're furious. No matter how amazing it is that this is technology is even out there and a giant company like this can even move around the world the way that it does, if your package arrives a day late, you're like, what's going on here? Same thing with like an airline situation. And by the way, for an airline, it's not about a matter of days, it's a matter of hours or in some cases minutes. These tubes that fly all over the globe, and it's really safe, at least statistically speaking, and you kind of get wherever you want to go in kind of a non-pandemic type of world. It's all amazing, and yet if your plane arrives 20 minutes later than it's supposed to, if it takes off 45 minutes later than it's supposed to, you're furious about that. And sometimes it's not even just minutes. Sometimes it's seconds. I just got Disney Plus. My wife and I did for our kids. I think it's amazing to have all that entertainment right there at your fingertips. But if that little wheel before the movie starts spins for about 5 seconds too long, all of a sudden you get a little bit impatient about why is the movie not starting. And, all of that kind of, waiting on as the end user is called, I think there's a word for this called like last mile logistics, right? It's like the difference between the package showing up at your house on time or not, the difference between the plane arriving on time or not, the difference between the Disney Plus movie being a satisfactory experience when you actually watch it or not. It's that last mile that makes all the difference. And anybody who's ever handled a big organization like that, I'll tell you that the money that you spend on like sort of last mile customer service is the most significant expense in many cases that you kind of have in a business and an entity. And I think there's a comparison to that in college football as well. Georgia has put itself into the conversation of truly national elite contenders, but somehow, some way, the difference between Georgia and Alabama is what happens over the course of that last mile. What happens with the players when they get to Alabama developing maybe just a little bit better, or the coaching in Alabama maybe just a little bit more buttoned up, or whatever it has been that has explained the difference in success. Somehow that last mile for Alabama has been very different than it's been for Georgia and the other championship contenders. So that's why we're not going to get too deep into the preseason hype here this season for Georgia. We'll talk about it. We'll acknowledge the championship expectations, but we're not going to pretend that last mile to be traveled. The difference between being a preseason top 5 team and actually number 1 at the end of the year is not a significant step to take. Georgia can take it in 2021, but it's not going to be easy. Now, on a similar topic, at least similar theme, slightly different topic, let's say this way. If you go back to a year ago, when Nick Saban and Alabama were not in the national championship, Saban appeared, like some coaches do, on the TV broadcast before the game as kind of a pregame special analyst, sharing insight, having had played, these teams before, LSU, the reigning national champion, having played them during the season. His insight into what it was going to be like in that game was obviously valuable, so he goes on TV. And he said something almost exactly a year ago that at the time was kind of eyebrow-raising. We kind of described it as kind of a subtweet maybe of Kirby Smart from the ESPN telecast a year ago. But here we are 12 months later, and it hardly seems controversial at all. What Saban described a year ago is clearly what college football is now as we get ready to head towards 2021. So let's go back a year ago, predating the championship that Alabama won last night, and looking ahead to what Georgia has facing it the next couple of years. I think the Saban words from last January certainly proved to be prophetic. Let's hear Nick Saban.
When you're a defensive-minded coach and you've grown up running the ball, being conservative, playing good defense and winning games, and the game changed. When RPOs came and everybody spread it out, the game changed. And if you don't join that crowd, you're never going to be able to make enough explosive plays.
Saban says the game has changed, and you've got to join the crowd. As I said, last year, that was like, ooh, that's a big deal. But now, that's so non-controversial, it's almost a mundane statement. It's obviously true that the game has changed, and it's obviously true that anyone who wants to win a national championship has to join the crowd of programs that are exploding offensively. I think the record for, single season passing efficiency has been broken like 5-6 years in a row. We're just in kind of an unprecedented era of offensive success. And if you're a school like Georgia that wants to be a part of that discussion, you've obviously got to join that, and you've got to be doing big things offensively. And the good news is that as Georgia ends the 2020 season, that it seems to be on its way towards doing that, right? Settled in with JT Daniels at quarterback. Daniels played well to conclude the season. Found the offensive coordinator that may give you a chance to be on offense like some of the ones we've been watching on TV the last couple of years. It seems like Todd Monken's got that possibility out there in front of him. But let's not sugarcoat how difficult the task truly is. Because when you watch Alabama last night, it's almost amazing to think they've only won one of the last 3 national championships. When you see them dominating the way they were last night, it seems like they have won or should be winning every championship that's played because that's how good they look to be. But the truth is they didn't win it in 2019, and the truth is they didn't win in 2018. So what has it taken to beat Alabama these last couple of years? The teams from Bama that didn't win championships? Well, all it really took was the number 1 overall pick in the NFL draft, a unprecedented offensive showing from LSU a year ago. Trevor Lawrence in 2018 for Clemson, going to go down as one of the all-time greats in the sport. That is what it has taken to beat Alabama. And unfortunately for Georgia, hard to imagine a similar level of success won't be required. That JT Daniels has to be more than just good. He may even need to be more than just a first-round pick level performer next season at Georgia in 2021. He may need to be every bit as good as Burrow was for LSU in 2019, every bit as good as Lawrence was in 2018 and through the totality of his career, an eventual number 1 overall pick. That may need to be what JT Daniels needs to do. And same thing for Todd Monken, who'll lead that offense. I mean, when LSU had Joe Brady in 2019 running its passing game, he was barely 30 years old. All of a sudden now, a year later, he's about to become an NFL head coach. That's what LSU had calling passing plays for it back in 2019. And some similar level of success for Georgia in 2021 might be required as well. It is not impossible for that to happen. It could be just that good for Georgia. But the path to get there will be that difficult. And the last mile is the one that matters more than anything else. Championship expectations for Georgia in 2021 are justified. They are to be expected. I think fans, players, coaches, everyone embraces it. But the actual task of getting over the hump, of knocking off a bull of the woods the way that Alabama's proven itself to be, that is not going to be an easy task. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you, and thanks for being with us today. Presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We are available for you on a bunch of different platforms, no matter how you get to us. Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter on video, podcast form, wherever you find them. Apple, Google, Spotify, all the big tech giants making this show a reality for all of you. We certainly appreciate all of that. And with our friends on the radio in Athens, on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, great to be with you as well. And by the way, huge thanks to Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We would not be able to do this show if not for them. And so many of you can tell a similar story of some sort of calamity you would have been facing at your house if not for my friends at ESOG. Now listen, Engineered Solutions of Georgia is a proud partner of UGA. That makes them fun to do business with. It's always great to support companies that support UGA. They've also been good friends of ours here at DawgNation Daily for a really long time as well. And if you're dealing with either a foundation issue or a waterproofing issue, two of the things that can keep homeowners awake, sleepless nights, maybe more than anything else, ESOG is the company you need to trust for that because they have 2 full-time engineers on staff. They're a solutions-based company. They live to solve problems like the ones you're facing. Sometimes they can tell you it's not as big a deal as it might seem, but if it is a substantial fix, all the more reason to want smart folks doing it for you. Easy to get in touch with as well. Simply dial 678-ESOG now. That's right, that phone number, very easy to remember, 678-ESOG now. That'll get you in touch with my friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We will get Connor Riley coming up in just a moment on our program today. Before that, though, let's go around the doghouse, delivered by our friends at Marco's Pizza today. And yes, Tyreek Stevenson is now in the transfer portal. I talked about this in the show the other day. I was kind of hot and bothered about this a couple days ago. I'm even more so now. Stevenson's appearance in the transfer portal on Stevenson's Facebook page, I think he's now said that he's a Miami student, so it certainly seems obvious that he's leaving Georgia to go back to his hometown school there at Miami. And all of this was seemingly foreshadowed in a Miami Herald piece from a couple of days ago. Many of you remember this from the show last week. Let me just kind of read through these quotes from Barry Jackson in the Miami Herald as a way of just very quickly setting us up where we need to go. I'm going to run through this pretty fast. So this is what Barry Jackson wrote the other day for the Miami Herald. A source briefed on the situation said the Hurricanes would love to snag Georgia and former Miami Southridge cornerback Tyreek Stevenson. The one problem, the Miami Herald writes, is Stevenson played for the Bulldogs in their bowl game on Friday, and there's no indication if he wants to transfer to UM or anywhere. The Miami Herald would go on to say, we know Miami has interest and his name has been tossed around internally. This is something to monitor. The unknown is whether Stevenson has any inclination to leave Georgia and return home. He has given zero public indication if he wants to leave, the Herald then would go on to say, but there has been chatter inside UM about him. That's Barry Jackson, Miami Herald. And the point that I made on last week's show is, there's not supposed to be any chatter in some football building about a player who is on someone else's roster and has not yet entered the transfer portal. Now, if you're a Miami fan, you happen to be tuned in to watch this or listen, or if you're just a non-Georgia fan, this sounds like crying over spilt milk, which is fine. You can say that if you want to, but here's my question. Do we want college football to have any rules at all? Because let's face it, if you're a government with no laws, you're not much of a government. It's the same thing for a sport. If you're a sport with no rules, eventually you might not be much of a sport either. Now, ultimately, if Stevenson wants to be at Miami, it's probably best that he not be at Georgia. But the whole idea that there was chatter inside the Miami building about a player on Georgia's roster who at that point in time was not in the transfer portal, that's not the way that college football is supposed to go. And it's all fine and good when it's, some player coming, some program coming to steal a player from Georgia, because there's a lot of folks out there that think Georgia's recruited too well as it is. They've got more players than they can use. Why not go take somebody and move them off and go somewhere else? But, folks, when you kind of open the door to this kind of anarchy and allow, this kind of lawlessness to rule at this time of year in the sport, eventually it hurts everybody. And, listen, you can say what you want about Tyreek Stevenson. Frankly, I think that he's probably making an unwise decision. I realize the gravitational pull to go back home, but presumably there was a reason why he chose to leave home, earlier when he came to Georgia the first time. This is a program that's turned DeAndre Baker into a Thorpe Award winner. It's going to make Eric Stokes, who was not a big-time recruit, nowhere near as high a recruit as Stevenson was, into a high NFL draft pick. The truth is, all the cornerbacks that are leaving Georgia this year are all going to get drafted in some form or fashion, and a number of them are probably going to get drafted pretty high. Clearly, being at Georgia as a defensive back would seem to be a pretty good professional decision, but maybe for personal reasons, Stevenson's, wanting to go back home. I'm not mad at him, but I am mad at the situation. I don't mind telling you, no matter how much of a square that it makes me sound like, I don't mind telling you that I think college football ought to have some rules. I think it ought to enforce them. And that means penalizing people for when they break them. It's around the doghouse. It's delivered today by our friends at Marco's Pizza. A much happier topic for me is that America's most beloved pizza, real, authentic pizza made the Italian way, and frankly, very health and safety conscious right now. Baked in a 450-degree oven, then delivered to you, contactless and touchless once it comes out of that oven. You love that. You also love the great savings that you get at Marlowe's as well. I've told you about these specialty pizzas before, like the deluxe, the garden, the all meat, or the white cheesy. Well, you can get one of those and a large 2-topping pizza right now for just $23.99. You can find it online at marcos.com or check it out on the Marcos app as well. It's around the doghouse, delivered by Marco's Pizza here today. All right. As you might imagine, Before we are done on today's program, we will talk a little bit about the end of the Justin Fields era in college football, what specifically that means for UGA, and just kind of the hot topic that's been amongst Georgia fans now for over the course of the last couple of years. We'll put a bow on all of that today. We'll look at where Georgia falls on a lot of these way too early top 25 rankings. So we have much, much more to cover before we're done on today's program. But a guy who was watching the championship game last night keenly and probably as impressed with Alabama as I was as well. What else can you say about that? Let's talk to Connor Riley here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We'll say hello to Connor Riley here. And Connor, as I said before, I do want to talk to you a lot about the game last night. I don't know what you could say other than Bama was just unbelievably impressive for a single season, maybe as good as we've seen. We will do that coming up. But before we get there, let me let you join in on what I was just saying. On Tyreek Stevenson, the transfer portal, I don't mind sounding like a square on this, Connor. I think that a sport needs rules. I think those rules need to be enforced. The idea that we have from a August body of journalism, the Miami Herald, proof that there was already talk of Tyreek Stevenson at Miami before into the transfer portal. That doesn't set well with me. If Stevenson doesn't want to be at Georgia, so be it. Whatever. But I don't have a problem saying I think that college football ought to have some sort of semblance of rule of law or whatever you want to call it. I don't like this situation. What do you think about it?
Yeah, to harken back to the Nick Saban quote from 2013 when offense was really exploding, is this what we want the sport to be? Do we want college football to become the NBA? And as an NBA fan, I can tell you right now, I'm kind of frustrated with the constant talk of star churn and where certain star players are going and whatnot, and how long is this person really here for. And I think this Miami situation with Tyreek Stevenson, and look, I certainly understand wanting to go and play at home, but it's also pretty clear Miami was putting out feelers like saying, hey, Tyreek, come home. We have a starting spot for you. We'll get this transfer rule sorted out. You'll be good to go. And I point out that the NCAA was supposed to vote this week on this one-time transfer rule, and that's been pushed back because that meeting was also tied to the name, image, and likeness bill. And, quite frankly, at this point, with the way things are going and with the Tyreek Stevenson thing, you saw it last year with Cade Mays, where becoming more of a trend. Maybe I'm okay with us not doing this one-time transfer thing, because if this is what it's going to lead to and teams sort of being left out to dry, I don't think that's good for the sport.
We talk about age differences a lot, your age difference compared to mine. What I'm about to say is very popular, or I should say very unpopular with people seemingly of your age, but more popular with people my age, that there's this fear right now to do anything that comes across as anti-player, that the NCAA has a bad image, and the way that the so-called amateur athletes are treated with people of a certain age seems to be a little bit of a controversial topic, so nobody wants to come across as anti-player. But Connor, I don't mind telling you that given the choice of being pro-sport or anti-player, I'd much rather be pro-sport, because if you don't take care of the sport, eventually there won't be a sport for the players to play. And stuff like this, even if it's just by a small degree, I do think erodes the sport a bit. You can't be, in my mind, so pro-player, willing to let them do whatever they want to do, that all of a sudden the integrity of kind of what binds these institutions together kind of gets unwound a bit.
Right, and you look at James Harden right now, and sort of I think what happens when pro-player movements go too far. He's making a ton of money, signed a long-term contract extension to be in Houston for a long time. Things don't sort of go his way. He pushes a bunch of roster moves that don't work out, and now he's trying his own way to get out of Houston and not play in Houston. And quite frankly, it's bad for the sport, because in a way it eventually gets to the point where it's turning these players into villains, and that's not what anyone sort of really wants. So, I certainly get and understand wanting freedom of movement. I get wanting to play closer to home, but at the same point in time, it also begins to become frustrating when, all right, are we just playing NCAA 2K? Or is this NCAA football where you have guys moving around all the time? It makes it, I think, a less fun and less enjoyable sport if if you land a big name recruit, and I'm not saying this is ever going to happen, but you land Keely Ringo, 5-star cornerback at Arizona, and 2 years later you're having to fight off Arizona State to keep him once again. That's not what anyone wants. There's a big reason why recruiting, as popular as it is now, isn't as widespread as it is. And if this is just going to be a continuation of that, I think it's really going to turn off a lot of college football fans.
Yeah, let me just say one more thing on this, then I want to move on. That when you look at Georgia's situation with defensive backs, producing a Thorpe Award winner in the past, they're going to have 4 defensive backs, I believe, get drafted here this year. That for Miami to convince Stevenson that his hometown team was a better place for him to be professionally than Georgia, I think the only way you can do that is to lie to him, but exaggerate something. You certainly can't point to the on-field results and say that Georgia's not a good place for defensive backs to be. If he's homesick, then I don't know what you're supposed to do about that. But when it comes to the actual professional future, the actual track record of success with defensive backs, if Miami's convincing him of something other than that, they're either lying to him or exaggerating something.
Yeah, this feels like, Stevenson's probably comfortable in knowing, hey, wherever I'm playing, I'm going to be a defensive back, and why not, an NFL caliber defensive back, why not do that a little bit closer to home? That's what it sort of feels like for me here.
You may be right about that. National championship game last night, it was fascinating to watch because of just the surgical precision of Alabama. And frankly, Connor, as a Georgia fan, there was a part of it that was a little bit depressing for me about just how easy Alabama makes it look. I jokingly said before you joined us that I never thought Mac Jones would start a game for Alabama at quarterback, and yet he ends his career as maybe the most single-season dominant quarterback in that program's history. Last year, I think commonly it was thought that Devontae Smith was no better than Alabama's third-best receiver. It was commonly thought during this season that he might only be Alabama's second-best receiver, and yet, he wins the Heisman Trophy. I have very little reason to think that Alabama won't just reload next year with a lot of people who have more success than we probably could have seen coming. I'm not saying that means they'll be better than Georgia, but Connor, until Georgia does it, I'm not going to come on here and boast and brag anymore about Georgia overtaking Alabama until it actually happens.
Yeah, that's the thing. We have to see it on the field. I hope the T-shirt makers out there in the world got their work done early, printed all those shirts, because it was just, from really that Kentucky game on, this Alabama team was operating at another level, and it really didn't matter who they were playing last night. I knew I was going to catch some flack for this tweet, but I sent it out as a joke anyway. In the first half against Georgia, Stetson Bennett scored 24 points. In the first half against Alabama, Justin Fields scored 17 points and finished the game with 24 points. Now, that first drive where they actually scored in the second half, Justin Fields showed why he is a much better quarterback than Stetson Bennett, but it kind of just goes to show you that it didn't matter who Alabama was playing this year. It didn't matter who you have. You could build a defense of the 11 best defensive players in college football. I'm still not sure that they could stop that Alabama offense. It was a perfect mix of scheme and talent. And to your point, yeah, a few weeks ago was saying, maybe Georgia starts the season as the number 1 ranked team in the country. And yes, Alabama's going to lose a ton offensively, and they're going to lose Steve Sarkisian. And I'll be interested to see what they look like next year. But at this point in time, unless you're going really in on, they're going to lose their best offensive lineman and the impact that has, I don't know how you don't give them the benefit of the doubt of saying, hey, this is still going to be the best team and the best well-oiled machine in the country.
And, people are going to really kind of get a lot of mileage out of the fact that Georgia was leading Alabama at halftime back in October as some sort of proof of something for the upcoming year. And, Connor, here's the thing. Georgia's actually led Alabama at the half the last 3 times they've played them, and they've lost all 3 of those games. That, as I said before you joined us, it's that last mile for some reason that really seems to matter for Alabama. They just know how to finish games. They know how to finish seasons. They just are buttoned up in a way that's not easy to emulate. Now, Georgia has done 90% of the work, maybe even 99% of the work. Georgia's one of the few teams that begins next season with any kind of semblance of a chance of winning the national championship. But that last mile has just proven to be the most difficult. In games, at the end of seasons, whatever else, and Alabama just somehow knows how to do that.
Yeah, for anyone that wants to bring up that, hey, Georgia was leading at halftime, Georgia was leading into the third quarter, I think it's also worth remembering how the final 4 possessions of that game on both Georgia's offense and Georgia's defense ended. Georgia did not score, and defensively, Alabama ended that game on offense going touchdown, 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 6-minute drive to end the game. Alabama blew Georgia off the field in that second half there. Ultimately, though, I think the one takeaway you have from last night is if you have a defensive disruptor in the front 7, like I think Georgia has a couple of guys who can be that next year, like Christian Barrymore was last night for Alabama, and you have the skill players on offense along with a gifted play caller, there's sort of the recipe you have there to overcome some of the deficiencies that this Alabama team, I think, pretty clearly had, specifically in the secondary. And it's hard not to look to Georgia and sort of see, all right, they have the skill players. Now, I don't think George Pickens is going to be as good as Devontae Smith, but they have the collection of talent there. I don't know if there's a running back as good as Najee Harris, but it's sort of there on offense to be had if Todd Monken can push those buttons as Steve Sarkisian did this season. And the defensive front seven, I actually think Georgia is going to be better than what Alabama's had next year. So while there are questions about the offensive line and how good that is, and for me, that's actually the number one question I have, more so than the secondary, even though that looks like a bigger weakness right now. How good is that Georgia offensive line going to be? Because they couldn't touch Mac Jones really all season unless they were blitzing like they did last night. And if you want to blitz Alabama, okay, you're going to put Devontae Smith in one-on-one coverage, and they're going to win that more often than you get home and blitz.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I said this before you came on, that if you look at Alabama, in some respects, it's actually amazing they haven't won more national championships than they have. They've only won one of the last three. What it has taken to beat them, though, is a number one overall pick at quarterback on an otherwise elite roster. That's what it's taken. Lawrence in 2018 would eventually become the number one overall pick, at least I believe he's going to. Obviously, Joe Burrow last season. That if you've got a big-time roster, and if you can give that big-time roster a number one overall pick level quarterback, and by the way, have him playing in a high-powered offense, the likes of which Joe Brady can lead, then you can get it done against Alabama, which, if you want to make the comparison to Georgia, it certainly gives a glimmer of hope for what Todd Monken can orchestrate next season, what JT Daniels can be the leader as the field general with, but it doesn't give you much room for error. Being the number 23 overall pick for JT Daniels next season is probably not good enough to beat Alabama.
No, yeah, and even, you look at that LSU loss, that was I think a 4-point final margin. Now, obviously, LSU led comfortably for most of the second half there, but we're going to find out just how good JT Daniels is if they get a chance to play Alabama, because that's the game, more so than even the Clemson game. I think that if that game gets played, if Georgia and Alabama do meet in the SEC championship game, and with what A&M all figures to lose along their offensive and defensive lines and where LSU and Auburn are right now, I still expect Alabama to be the favorite in the West next season. That's the thing with JT Daniels. That's the reason why he came back, to prove that he could be a number one draft pick. And to be a number one draft pick, it really, really helps when you put up a big game and big numbers against Alabama. If Justin Fields came out and won last night and looked great and did the 6 touchdowns that he had against Clemson and replicated that against Alabama, there'd be quite a bit more people discussing him as a possible number one pick as opposed to maybe now being the number 4 overall pick to the Atlanta Falcons. I
want to talk more about Fields directly in a moment, but let me just get one more from you before we get there. So Fields has the ribs. Trey Sermon leaves the game early. Ohio State is missing a number of key defensive linemen in the game. If those situations are different, does Ohio State have a chance to keep this game closer than they did last night?
It's a 14-point game instead of a 28-point game. I still don't think they're beating Alabama last night. There was a chance for some early stops, and Tommy Togiai, their defensive tackle, who did not play last night, is one of their better players on defense, and maybe he does make a difference on those 4th and shorts there early on in the game. But just what Devontae Smith did in that first half, 215 yards, 3 touchdowns on 12 catches. I just don't think they were going to stop that Alabama offense enough last night.
All right, total honesty here to close this out. I'm willing to be as candid as I possibly can. I'm a big fan of Justin Fields. I'm a Falcons fan. I would really like for the Falcons to draft Fields number 4 overall. I just think he'd be a fun guy to root for in a Falcons uniform, and I think a lot of the Falcons fans who are also Georgia fans probably feel the same way. So my credentials as someone who roots for Justin are pretty high. Yet I'm also willing to admit, as someone who cares more about Georgia football than I care about anything else from a sporting sense, I didn't want Justin Fields to win a national championship at Ohio State. I think it would have been problematic for Georgia had he done so, given the way that he left. I'm not necessarily proud of feeling that way, but those are my honest feelings, that it's good for Georgia that Fields didn't win at all, even though he did win a playoff game and made 2 college football playoff appearances. It did not end up being as bad as it could have been, given the way that he left. The Fields era in college football is now over. How will you remember it?
Justin Fields was pretty clearly a transcendent player, a very, very good one, a player who got Ohio State to multiple college football playoff appearances when that hadn't been something that had been happening all that much, even with the elite talent they had there. And honestly, as great as he is, and I think he's a top 5 pick, I think that Clemson game showed you what he could be when he was right. I actually think he played pretty well, all things considered, last night, given what he was that sort of hand he was dealt. Even if he was still on Georgia these last 2 years, Georgia's not winning a national title. They're not beating LSU last season. They're not beating Alabama. Now, next season's roster, I think with everything else that they have, the receivers, running back, the front 7, and now they have the quarterback with JT Daniels. I can see that. But as great as a player as Justin Fields are, they sort of ran into 2 historically great teams in LSU and Alabama. And, you know, I like you, as someone who works in the content business, I would have had to hear, oh, how could Georgia, this school that hasn't won a title since 1980, how can they let this championship caliber quarterback go? And we're not getting into the full story of how everything went down once again. But Justin Fields, great player, transcendent player, and for Georgia fans who very much, and I talked to a lot of them who wanted him to stay and wanted to see him actually win a championship last night. If he's on the Georgia roster this season, I still don't think they win a national title with him.
And here's the other thing, and even had Fields won last night, I think this would still been true, although it's now easier to believe this now, that the Fields saga may be the most single significant thing that's happened thus far in Kirby Smart's tenure as Georgia coach. But within a couple of years, we will have all forgotten about this. We who care about Georgia or cover Georgia, or even people from the larger sense, you know, national observers of college football, we will have moved on, and Georgia by then, a couple of years from now, will be defined by something totally different. Whatever JT Daniels does in 2021, the passing of the baton presumably to Brock Vandagriff after that, within a couple of years, whatever happened with Fields will just be deep in the rearview mirror. And if you don't believe me, consider this. Nick Saban once benched Jalen Hurts for Tua Tagovailoa in a national championship game. It seemed like at the time that made me the most single consequential choice he's ever made as a coach, and yet here we are talking about Mac Jones. We barely even remember what happened in 2017. The Field saga will be deep in the rearview mirror before long, too. This kind of is just all over with now.
Yeah, 2 things. One, Mac Jones won more national titles as a starting quarterback than Tua Tagovailoa did. Just imagine even saying that a season ago or a season and a half ago. And when it comes to Fields, you know, the night Clemson won their first national title with Deshaun Watson at quarterback, there's a story very deep in the archives of DawgNation I wrote sort of about the Georgia connection and you know, how that recruitment had sort of went down, obviously the Mike Bobo connection there. And Georgia fans were very upset and not happy. And times moved on. A lot of people forgot about, you know, Deshaun and that moment and everything that had sort of happened there. And to your point, a few years from now, if things continue to, you know, if Georgia wins a national title next year, everyone forgets about Justin Fields and that all goes away. If things continue to improve, going from Daniels to either Carson Beck or Brock Vandagriff, the farther we get away from this Fields story, the less and less we remember about the details from it.
You know, to finish off here, we talk a lot about championship expectations and everything else, but I do think that Georgia is heading towards at least what I presume to be a happy offseason. Now, you've got the situation going on with the sport about what it looks like in 2021, and that's something that's kind of out of Georgia's control. So when I say happy offseason, I'm not relating this in any way to the pandemic. But in terms of what Georgia can control and presuming that the sport will look fairly normal in 2021 when games are played, this is not the kind of desperate offseason maybe of a year ago where you were searching for quarterback, searching for offensive coordinator, nor is it the kind of angry offseason maybe the year prior to that when the field stuff was still very fresh in people's minds. I don't really know how the 2021 season ends, but I do think the build up to next season opener against Clemson, everything else that comes after that, I do get the sense it's going to be more enjoyable than the last couple of winters turning into spring have been.
Yeah, and my expectation right now is we'll find a way to get those spring practices and hold them and have them. You'll get sort of a more normal offseason, hopefully, as the vaccine gets rolled out and the coronavirus numbers hopefully go down over the course of the year, we start getting back to things looking more normal, and hopefully September 4th, me, you, Mike Griffith, Jeff Sintel, we're all back in the stadium again, covering a Georgia football game against Clemson. I think the happy offseason theme you sort of mentioned there, I think having that big carrot Clemson that first game of the year, I think certainly contributes to that more so than playing an Arkansas State, a Middle Tennessee State that you would normally potentially see them open with. So there's still a lot to talk about. I'm sure there'll be plenty of player movement throughout this offseason. That's just sort of, unfortunately, where we are in the sport right now. But like you said, I think because of what you saw at the end of this season with the offense, I think there's real optimism within this Georgia program going into a year really that we haven't had under Kirby Smart, because 2017 came out of nowhere. 2018, you were dealing with the questions of, all right, well, how do you place Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, Roquan Smith, Lorenzo Carter? For this time, really, I mean, yeah, secondary and offensive line are concerns, no doubt, but there's real optimism of what this team can be and the championship expectations that can potentially be met by this Georgia football team.
All right, Connor, great stuff. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. As you said, you'll be writing a bunch of stuff at DawgNation.com. I shall look forward to reading that and, of course, enjoying the chance to get to talk to you again very soon as well. I'll look forward to doing that then.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure, B.A.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Let me just say this. I'm going to do more of this before the show is done today, but something about what Connor was saying there made me think about this. There are different opinions about how the season went, right? I mean, and different opinions about a lot of things in life related to the pandemic and everything else, which I'm never going to get into right now. That's just not what we do. I certainly think the season was more good than bad, clearly, but there was one thing that was obviously missed this year, right? I mean, my gratitude for the fact that the season took place. We had these games to distract us from some of the more, heinous things that may be happening in life. I was very thankful to have college football all year long. We had the coaches, we had the players, we had the games. In some cases, we had the drama. There were some frustrating parts, but we had a lot of that. But let me tell you what was missing. If you're watching on video, you can see this. This is a dog walk from at some point this year. That may have been the Tennessee game. I honestly can't remember. But look what if you're not watching a video, I realize you can't see this. But look as the players come through, as Kirby Smart walks by there. Look what you don't see on either side of that barricade. There were no fans. And, last night there were some fans in the stadium for the national championship game. But this was a season that largely took place without fans in comparison to the way that we're used to seeing them. There were people, obviously, between the hedges at Dooley Field at Sanford Stadium, but it was not a full stadium. There was almost never any kind of tailgating or anything like that. And one of the interesting takeaways, I think, from this year is that the presence of fans does matter. That the fans do complete the sport, give it a sense of legitimacy that is sometimes called into question when the fans are not there. Because let's face it, now I think it remains to be seen what last night's championship game looks like. My guess is the ratings are pretty high. But across the board, even for the very big games this year, the ratings were a little lower than they were the year prior. Now, sometimes that's related to an election year. Sports ratings kind of go down. Some of that could be just the hard times that people were facing in their own life. But the sport did feel different without the full stadium. Sometimes I'll surf around on YouTube and things like that and go back and look at old college football stuff. And, I find myself really kind of gravitating towards the intensity of fans in games in the past. And back then, we just sort of took that as normal. I find myself craving that now, to feel and hear the roar of a real crowd, to hear the bands, the Redcoat Band back. You had neither band last night at the national championship game. I really, really missed that this year. I don't believe I'm the only one. It has been a good season, more good than bad. The presence of college football, I do think, has made life a little bit better, even though the journey for all of us this past 12 months has been a very hard one. But the fans not being there in full measure the way they have been in the past, I don't think there's any doubt about that. That was a missing piece in the sport, and as much as I love college football, it's not quite the same when you don't have the raucous environments, and that was certainly missed here this year. Let's transition. We'll do our SEC through now. And if you care about way too early top 25s, I do love them. Even though to start the show I say I'm going to reject the offseason hype. We're not going to buy into that too much around here. We're going to try to sidestep that. I still like it. I mean, I'm still entertained by it. And I'll give you 3 of the way too early top 25s. There will be more coming out in the days ahead. There may be more already. These are just the 3 that I happen to have seen. Georgia's number 4 in the way too early ESPN top 25. Number 5 in the Sporting News. By the way, shout out to the Sporting News, our buddy Bill Bender. I believe the Sporting News was the first out of the gate this year with way too early top 25s. I think they had theirs out yesterday morning, late morning, early afternoon, even before the national championship game was concluded. So Sporting News first out of the gate there on that. So 5th is where Georgia comes in on that. Georgia also coming in at number 4 on the 24/7 way too early top 25 there as well. I'll work off the ESPN ranking for a moment because, that's a pretty respected or at least paid attention to outlet. They do have Clemson number 1 for next season, so interesting to think about that. Georgia's week 1 opponent. They have Alabama at number 2. Here's the one thing I'm going to say about Alabama that hasn't already been said. We assume that Alabama reloads in every form and fashion, and I believe they probably will. But it is interesting to point out that the Alabama offense, which has been good before, has never quite been as good as it was this season, especially given the fact that Alabama had lost so much, and yet Sarkisian still made Mac Jones into an all-time great single-season quarterback, turned Devontae Smith into a Heisman Trophy winner. The assumption here is that whether it's Bill O'Brien or Adam Gase or whoever it is that Alabama hires, the Bama offense probably won't skip a beat. But is there a chance, at least, that Sarkisian is such a good offensive coordinator, Steve Sarkisian on his way to be Texas head coach, that replacing him will prove to be more difficult than replacing Lane Kiffin ended up being, or Brian Dable ended up being, or Mike Locksley ended up being? The Sarkisian offense is actually better than any of those offenses have been in recent years. I guess maybe there's a chance, maybe a glimmer of hope for those who don't like Alabama, that maybe there's a glimmer of hope that replacing Steve Sarkisian will prove to be a difficult thing to do for the Crimson Tide. On the ESPN ranking, Oklahoma is number 3. I understand where this comes from based on the way the Sooners played to conclude this season, based on the way that offensively Oklahoma is every single year. But the Alex Grinch defense is just, in big games, when it really matters, they don't get it done. And for the Oklahoma fans who ran around and celebrated the way they beat up on Florida, when Oklahoma has played SEC competition in games that have mattered, LSU in the previous year's college football playoff, Alabama the year before that, Georgia the year before that, especially in the second half, they just have not been able to get it done. So I understand the preseason noise around Oklahoma, but count me as someone who doesn't necessarily believe it. Ohio State comes in at number 5 after Georgia at number 4. Texas A&M comes at number 6, and that's where I'm going to stop and say this. As irony would have it, Alabama ended up beating Ohio State last night by the exact same score that Texas A&M lost to Alabama earlier in the year. And for a lot of Aggies fans, they use this as proof that they should have been in the college football playoff instead of a Notre Dame team that got blown out in its last game, or an Oklahoma State team that played far fewer games than what Texas A&M played. I definitely think that Texas A&M should have gotten more consideration for the college football playoff. I definitely think what A&M did on the winning streak they put together at the end of the season was more difficult and challenging than they were given credit for. I don't think the result at the end of the season would have been any different. I don't think A&M could have beaten Alabama in a rematch. But A&M truly being one of the 4 best teams in the country this season, I think there's a chance that was true. And the fact they didn't get more consideration for that 4th playoff spot, because I believe the distaste that the committee had for pitting 2 teams together who had already played, and the result was as clear as it was, frankly, for Texas A&M, I think that's kind of unfair and interesting to think that already highly rated next year's way too early top 25s, that Jimbo Fisher may be finally on his way to building something there in College Station that's worth paying attention to. We'll make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, I want to talk a little bit more about something I was just addressing with Connor Riley a minute ago, that Justin Fields has been a hot topic among Georgia fans. In fact, such a hot topic at times, too hot, to the point where you didn't really need to talk about it on shows like this too much, and you didn't really need to have too many threads on message boards about it, because it just sort of got volatile. Fields, an impressive talent who didn't get a chance to start at Georgia, went to Ohio State, had immediate success there, and it was just controversial. But now that the Fields era is over, I do think it's time to turn down the heat on this discussion. As I said, one way or another, none of this will be remembered 24 months from now. We'll all have moved on to something else. And for Georgia fans who seemingly have had hard feelings with all of this, it's important to note that the parties themselves don't seem to have those same hard feelings. I want to go back to a podcast interview that Kirby Smart did a few weeks ago with Brian McFadden, former NFL defensive back. And in the midst of this discussion, Kirby Smart is asked about Justin Fields, kind of how all that went down. And certainly when you listen to Kirby talk about all of this, you don't hear any anger in his voice or worry in his voice. This is not a topic that he's afraid to address. And now that the Fields era is done, looking back on how exactly it did go down at Georgia probably feels a little bit appropriate. Here's Kirby from the show the other day.
Number one, he's a great kid. Sister plays softball here. He's very bright, well-rounded kid. And so many players on the team really loved him. I think with the new recruiting age that we live in and the hype that follows, the number one premier player. I mean, he and Trevor were really the top two players coming out in the country, and they happened to be 30 miles from each other. And a lot of comparisons happened with Justin to Trevor. So it was very evident to us early on in the year that as Trevor had success and began to play, and I think the Texas A&M game, he got in and played more and more, Justin felt the same way that, hey, I'm as good as him and I should get an opportunity to play. And, at the time we had Jake Fromm, who was playing pretty well. He was playing good football and went toe-to-toe with Alabama in the SEC championship game. And, we didn't play real good defensively, but Jake did a lot of good things. It was really a tough situation to manage because Justin is extremely talented.
I think all of that Smart says there is very honest. By the way, that's the All Things Covered podcast. I'll put a link to it when I post the show later on. Smart said the management of the situation was really difficult because we had an entrenched starter. By the way, late in the season, he mentioned the Alabama game, the SEC championship. You could also say the Florida game in which Fromm played very well in 2018, that you had an entrenched starter who at the end of the season was playing pretty well. But there will always be a chance that Smart should have made a different decision. Maybe he should have just chosen Fields over Fromm, even given the way that Fromm was playing there in 2018, and even given the fact that Fromm had led Georgia to the title game back in 2017. But here's the thing that sometimes doesn't get considered in all of this. The Fields saga at Georgia wasn't solely about the choices that Kirby Smart was making at the time. Justin Fields also has to take some ownership for the decisions he made around this as well. And we are led to believe from sources close to him that he was advised not to go to Georgia because of all the things that made playing at Georgia tough. And yet Fields still made the decision to go to UGA. In fact, let me give you Trent Dilfer here from an interview that I did with Dilfer at the Super Bowl a couple of years ago. Dilfer, obviously the former head coach of the Elite 11 quarterback camp and a guy that knows Justin Fields very, very well, who had Fields' ear prior to coming to Georgia, and Dilfer told him not to do it. Let me go back in time to just, about 2 years ago when Dilfer told us this.
I was probably the only guy that wasn't surprised. I told Justin I didn't think it was a good move to go there. He's a unique talent, one of the best I've ever seen, but I mean, these kids, they think that when they're in high school, they're just going to go in and beat out the stud that's ahead of them, and Jake's a great player. And Jake's a guy that not only is a great player, but he's a player that gets the most out of everybody, and people gravitate towards him. So the dual thing was never going to work, having the two quarterbacks splitting time. And Jake, because of his command of the offense and the success he had as a freshman, to me, I just didn't think it was a good move. I kind of like what Justin's done now. These kids should have the ability to move and go develop as players.
Once again, that's Trent Dilfer from an interview that we did at the Super Bowl a couple of years ago when it was in Atlanta. We had a chance to talk to him about that. Here is, I think, the summation of the totality of the Justin Fields era at Georgia and maybe the Justin Fields era in college football. Great competitors. I think Fields is a great competitor, and when you want to play. You want to play right away, and you want to play at whatever school you choose. And that's what led him to initially come to Georgia. If you're a great competitor as a coach, which Kirby Smart is, you want as much elite talent as you can get. So obviously, both Kirby Smart and Justin Fields have needles that kind of run into the red a bit. They want to do things their way. And sometimes there may be some initial hurt feelings about that. But ultimately, Fields has moved on. He's got a great football career ahead of him. Georgia has moved on. It's got a great future ahead of it, including at the quarterback position. And frankly, probably all is well that ends well. Golden Shoe winner today as a part of our Gator Hater roll call. Let me give it to everyone who made this college football season possible. Thank you so much for your tireless efforts, especially the players. We'll see you tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And for all of you here on video, let me just say, and on video, time now for R.S. Andrews Cool Down. We'll do air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric, and we certainly appreciate R.S. Andrews for being a part of all of this. By the way, if your heating system's not working the way that you want it to, make sure you check them out online at rsandrews.com. They can take really good care of you on all of that. We do have to be a little bit quick today because we got a lot of stuff going on. So let me dive in. I'll do some YouTube comments first. I'll do Facebook after that, and all things considered, we're only going to do a few of these today because I do have to move on today. Got a lot going on. But I hope you're doing well, and I'm very glad to have you with us. Michael Porter to the shoe. Yeah, the golden shoe here is in honor of Marco Wilson, the throne shoe against Florida. So, or I should say against LSU for Florida. And so as we do our Gator Hater roll call every day, we are honoring some folks with this. Figuratively speaking, the trophy stays with me, but the golden shoe will be given out each and every day. There you go. There you get a nice look at that. Looking good. The golden shoe. Very, very nice. Very, very nice. Let's see what else is going on. Noah Sheldon says ESPN hates Georgia. Hard to say that about Kirk Herbstreit, though, given all the nice things he said about Georgia. Frank Patterson says 2 years ago, if our offensive weapons didn't go pro, we win a title. This year, our defensive players would have stayed. We win the title. Got to figure out just one more year piece. Yeah, it's those little things in the end. You know, whether it's players who come back or having the scheme just buttoned up just right. It's those little tiny details on that last mile that make all the difference in the world. Let's see what else. Let's see what else is going on over here on YouTube. Jay, it's interesting. You're seeing a lot of Missouri talk in the comment section over the last few days. Maybe it's all coming from Jay Shipes, but he says the toughest game next year is Clemson. Then after that, Missouri, which is a very interesting take. Obviously, it seems like Clemson is by far and away Georgia's toughest game on paper next year. I am very interested, though, to see where it all shakes out eventually with Florida. New quarterback, is it Emory Jones? Does Richardson have a chance? Are there more transfer names that show up for Florida, whether it's Gilbert or not? I am interested to see how it shakes out for Florida. Jeremy Harbin says, I think this is a good point. He says, Georgia's got a lot of top skill guys coming in the next few years and a quarterback that can lead them, not to mention a top defense every year. So Georgia's window won't close for many years, if at all. I think that Jeremy's right about that. Georgia justifiably has championship expectations next season, but it is not, in my mind, a championship or bust season. That's not what next year is for Georgia because, as Jeremy rightly says, the window doesn't close if Georgia doesn't win it all next season. Now, could you make a case that it's hard to foresee it ever being quite as in place for Georgia as it looks to be next year? Other than some questions around the secondary, maybe a couple of offensive line-related questions, you're never going to have a perfect roster. Certainly you could maybe make the case that it'd be hard for Georgia to ever have more talent than it looks to have next year, but certainly Georgia's not going to have, precipitously less talent at any point in time in the future either. A couple more YouTube comments. We'll go to Facebook. Scott Harris says, I need a prediction on the fan count for the Clemson game if we play it. So I do believe Georgia-Clemson will certainly be played in 2021. I'm at least optimistic enough to say that. I don't know if I'm optimistic enough to say there will be significantly more fans. I have a hard time seeing the stadium be half full. I just do. Now, there's a lot of time for this kind of stuff to change, and I'm not basing this on any kind of scientific belief or anything like that because, frankly, I don't have enough knowledge to have any real scientific belief. But it seems like the world would have to change really, really fast to have people sitting within 6 feet of each other and not feel very, very weird. And I don't want to get into any kind of pandemic stuff because, frankly, I don't care what you think about it. But just in terms of what will be, 15 to 20%, maybe 30% capacity, but I don't see it being much more than that. I wish that was not the case. I certainly hope I'm wrong, but I don't see much more than that. Green Soldier, the subject of the vaccine. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what it all comes down to, certainly. And look, maybe this is one of those things where once the vaccine really gets going, maybe it just accelerates at a rate that I can't quite comprehend right now. That, it seems like we kind of incrementally got to this point. It feels like we'll kind of incrementally work our way back to normal. But maybe it won't be that. Maybe it'll just, once the vaccine kind of takes hold across, society, maybe it'll be aggressively eradicated. Maybe that's the way it's going to go. But in my mind right now, I can sort of only picture something that feels marginally better than what we had this year. And maybe we're, fully back to normal in 2022. And I would have scoffed at anybody who would have said that a few months ago is way too pessimistic, but I don't know, man. It's tough out there these days. Frank Patterson says, in the secondary with real experience. Yeah, there's not a lot of real experience in secondary right now. That's going to be an issue, that you're going to be putting a lot of guys out there who, don't quite have the same level of experience that Georgia's kind of used to having in that situation. And that will make things not very easy. That is not an easy thing to do. Excuse me. That is not an easy thing to do. So the chances of the secondary not being a strength for Georgia next season is probably a real reality. Now, could it get better over the course of the year because of the talent you have, guys like Jalen Kimber and obviously Keely Ringo and others? Yeah, it's a possibility, but everyone's got a weakness they're worried about going into a season, or at least a perceived weakness. And for Georgia next season, it certainly seems as if the secondary is what that's likely to be. Let's get some Facebook comments. Patrick Nicholson says, any word on Carson Beck? We need a capable backup to compete with Vandegrift while JT plays. So the only assumption I can make about Beck is right now he will be that guy to compete with Vandegrift to earn the number 2 quarterback spot next season. Now, I'm also willing to make the assumption that Carson's probably not that happy that he didn't get to play any more than he did this year. Everybody would feel that way, right? I mean, that doesn't make Carson unique. Everyone wants to play, and every player, I'm sure, believes they should be playing right away. The one thing, though, I have said over and over again when this kind of subject has come up, that the way that Carson was treated by Georgia the way that Carson was treated by Georgia this past season was not weird. This is kind of what happens when you're, even a 4-star recruit that comes into a place like Georgia. A lot of these guys do have to wait. So Beck waiting this year was not weird. It doesn't even mean that Beck's necessarily behind schedule. It just means that maybe for some people too much was assumed to happen too soon. It's been kind of quiet on the Beck front in terms of how he's performed at practice or how he's kind of growing and maturing. I really don't know much about that. I haven't heard much about that. But what you saw from Mac Jones last night was there's real value in waiting your turn. There's real value in sticking it out, growing with the program, growing internally within the program, and then getting your chance to shine after that. There's some real value in being able to do that. And so hopefully a guy like Carson Beck takes note of that and looks forward to doing maybe the same thing himself. Connor Graham says, I think that Kimber and Ringo are going to be stars. Dan Lanning mentioned it before Cincinnati game. Yeah, could very well be. Could very well be. Jimmy Durham, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that. Don Williams on Tyreek Stevenson. Listen, I thought that Stevenson had a chance to be a really good player. I did talk to Tyreek after the SEC championship game in 2019, and he was fairly honest. I wasn't the only person they talked to, but he was fairly honest that he wasn't super happy at the beginning of the year when he wasn't playing very much. It was a shock to him. And it certainly seems like that Georgia in 2019 had to kind of fashion a role for him just so they could say they got him on the field. They let him kind of be a designated cornerback blitz guy. It seems like that's the role that he occupied second half of the year for Georgia back in 2019. But that doesn't mean that I didn't think he had the chance to be a real player. And 2021 was supposed to be the year in which he showed that. And, his impatience seems to have gotten the best of him, and maybe he goes on and has great success there at Miami. But I certainly am of the belief that Stevenson could have been a big player for Georgia. Epic, thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate that. Epic Robinson, thank you. And as Michael Webb points out, the thing about Tyreek is he could have occupied potentially a number of positions for Georgia in that secondary, which would have made him a good one. Montegas Map says, I think that Bama does a better job of evaluating talent better than Georgia. I have to admit, this is something I have been thinking a lot about lately. Think about think about Tyson Campbell and Patrick Stan at American Heritage High School together. Georgia gets Campbell. I was thrilled about that. I think Campbell's a pretty good player. But Alabama gets Surtain, and he's like an All-American type player. Was he developed at Alabama better? Was he better in high school and Alabama just knew it? Was this is an example of Alabama getting their pick of guys over Georgia, and even within the 5-star category, Alabama still getting the pick of the litter within the 5 stars. Think about the kid, what's his name? Will Anderson, the freshman linebacker of Alabama, that led the SEC in sacks, I think. This is a guy that was not a 5-star prospect, and yet his success at Alabama this season from a statistical standpoint was pretty eye-opening. Was this a guy that was kind of always better than his recruiting profile suggested? Was he, that level of 4-star talent that Alabama just got more out of? There are a lot of examples of this where you can point to a guy that goes to Alabama. In some cases, it's either a 5-star among 5 stars, or in some cases, it's a 4-star who plays like a 5-star, or, kind of whatever you want to point to, where they just have had success. Even within the realm of elite recruits, their guys have just kind of, in some cases, outperformed the rest. And somebody said on the comment section a moment ago, that's better talent evaluation. There's a chance that's exactly what it is. It could also be better player development. Could be a number of things. Could be it's a possibility that it's easier to succeed in a place in which so many people are succeeding around you. That may be true as well. I do think it's pretty interesting. Matt Talley says we've had plenty of 3 stars that we develop into studs. Yeah, I'm not saying that Georgia's somehow deficient in that. I'm not saying that. But I am very interested in the small differences that seem to make all the difference for Alabama. I'm very interested in that. And in some cases, as I said before, it's 5 stars who outperform their other 5-star peers. Or in some cases, it's lesser recruits who kind of play like a 5-star. And you're right to say, Georgia's got Jordan Davis, got Eric Stokes, has got a lot of guys who really blossomed at Georgia. That's what makes Georgia better than like 90% of the rest of college football. I mean, if Georgia played all 129 other teams in college football, Georgia beat most of them. The overwhelming majority of them couldn't even come close to hanging with Georgia. We know that. But in the comparison with Alabama, what is it that makes Alabama different? And some of those player performances, they do get my attention from time to time. Ben Mathis says, I think it's better development. Certainly could be. We got to get ready to go. I've really got to roll here. Robert Barnes looking forward to seeing Latavius Brini next year. Could be a big year for Latavius. He certainly looked good in the bowl game. I'd agree with that. Let me get one more on YouTube as well. Thomas Tyson says, this is such a dumb argument. Georgia has failed to win a title because either the defense is suspect or the offense is ancient. And going 3 and out. Blame Kirby for that, not developing talent. I don't know about that. I mean, I understand where you're coming from. That's certainly a big part of it as well. But I think all of this goes together to equal the same kind of thing. That if it was as simple as pointing to just one thing, then obviously it'd be easy to fix. It's kind of what we used as the theme of our show today, that those final steps towards a journey to a national championship are just probably the most difficult, and we'll look forward to watching Georgia attempt to take those steps here this year. Thank you for being here as part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down today, as a part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. As we get ready to say goodbye to you, I'll also remind you, check out our friends at the AJC online at ajc.com. You can get everything that's going on in our state, including a great interview with Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, all the stuff that's gone on in our state lately, one-on-one exclusive with Governor Kemp in the pages of the AJC today. You can check that out. And also school systems battling the coronavirus, everything that's going on with that. You can follow that. Sports news. We talked a little Falcons on the show today with the pending hire. It could be Joe Brady's the next Falcons head coach, the former LSU play caller. That'd be fun to think about. And who knows what the Falcons do with the number 4 overall pick, and Hawk stuff and everything else. Check it out online, ajc.com, for your Atlanta news now. Thanks for being here as part of the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Find them online at rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. And I'll see you back here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. I look forward to speaking to you then, everybody.